Gotta select the right speaker for me to hear. I suppose we already heard them say we're now in the live stream. Is that correct? Okay, good. Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us here today for this conversation about innovation. It's a good day when we can have a conversation like this. It's sponsored by LexisNexis, and they have come up with an interesting way to look at innovation that really, in my words, we'll hear more about how they characterize it in a more technically accurate way, but it equalizes the playing field when you're trying to decide who is really carrying out game-changing innovation and doing some real creative things. So a lot of times when you see these top 100 lists, you'll see them dominated by the large companies that have large budgets that do the most filing. In this particular list, you'll find that there are a number of the companies that you would expect to be there, but there are also a number of smaller companies and mid-sized companies that normally don't get the love, but that are doing really great innovation. So LexisNexis has this way to kind of look at a portfolio, see what the portfolio is compared to other patents, and then you get a real true value of what innovation is going on in these corporations. So we're going to talk about what it is that these companies, big and small, are doing right, and what lessons can be learned from what they're doing. So we're going to have a unabashed 90 minutes or thereabouts conversation about innovation and everything that's good and what you all should be doing and what you should be telling your supervisors you should be doing if you want to be on this list or any kind of other list. So happy to be sponsored by LexisNexis. We'll hear more about the report here in a moment, but what I'd like to do is go ahead and introduce our speakers. So here's today's agenda. We're going to go through the opening thoughts, and we're going to talk about the report. Then we're going to have a roundtable conversation. Then we're going to do our final thoughts as we always do, and then get to as many questions as we possibly can. So let me take this moment to introduce our speakers if we can. You all know me. I'm Gene Quinn, president and founder of IPWatchdog.com, and joining us from LexisNexis is Nick Valentino, and he's the leader of IP customer success, and he also is very familiar with this report, has been involved in the report, and has created a lot of the charts that you're going to see in here. And we'll be able to answer questions about the methodology, and he'll tell us a little bit about the methodology as we go along. So happy to have Nick here with us here today. He's manning the PowerPoint because he's created the slides here today. So thanks for joining us, Nick. We really appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
Then on the next slide, we have our other speakers here, who we have Jake Mangan, and Jake is he has a JD and an LLM from a place that's very near and dear to my heart, the University of New Hampshire Franklin Pierce School of Law, but he also is senior IP counsel at Ofino, and Ofino is really a local company for us, and they're in the SEP space, and they do a lot of really creative things. So I know a little bit more maybe about Ofino than a lot of other companies just because the proximity. If you haven't heard of Ofino, you're going to hear of Ofino, and I'm sure that that'll become apparent today as we talk about what they do and what they do right. And I'm a real fan of what they're doing there. And before Jake joined Ofino, he was a partner in an IP boutique in the DC metro area. So glad to have you here with us today, Jake. Next, we have Mark Campagna, and Mark is a senior director of patent portfolio strategy at Medtronic, and he manages almost 50,000 assets and the entire IP budget. He's also responsible for patent licensing activities for Medtronic's worldwide patent portfolio, and he was previously VP for patent enforcement at TiVo. So very Happy to have you join us, Mark. I've tried to get you on a couple panels before, and I'm glad this has worked out. I've always really wanted to bring your insights to our audience, so glad to have you here today. Thanks for joining us. And then certainly last but not least is Sean Sullivan. He serves as lead IP counsel for Catalyzer, which is a startup accelerator dedicated to maximizing societal impact. And they were founded by a serial entrepreneur, and they support a family of medical imaging, DNA, and protein sequencing and pharmaceutical development. And Sean directs the internal IP function for each of the 4C operating companies. So happy to have this panel here today to talk about what it is that they see themselves doing right. We had also said Pauline was going to be joining us. Unfortunately, Pauline had an emergency come up and she was not going to be able to be here with us today. So it'll just be the guys here today. So gentlemen, before we turn it over to Nick to tell us about the methodology that had each of your companies in the top 100, what I'd like to do is get your preliminary thoughts on innovation. You know, big picture. When you hear about innovation and doing it right and not making mistakes and trying to maybe convince your management that what needs to be done really does need to be done, what words of wisdom or initial thoughts do you have for our audience? Let's start in the order in which I introduce you. Jake, let's start with you.
Sure. Thanks, Gene, for the introduction and having me here. I think our focus at Ofino that's worked right is, we focus on three aspects: getting the right people in place, put them in the right environment, and design the right process. And we feel like if we can maximize those steps, then we'll come up with the right inventions and innovations and get the strongest patents we can. So those are kind of my thoughts on this.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Jake. Mark, let's go next to you. Your initial thoughts to get us going here.
Sure. So at Medtronic, we focus a lot on our mission, which is to alleviate pain, restore health, and extend life. So that's the overall mission for the entire company. And the way that we try to, incorporate that into IP and what we do is, we want to make sure that our budget is proportional to the R&D spend, right? And because the innovation is coming out of R&D, and if R&D is going up at 10%, then hopefully our budget is going up at 10%, or it's going to be very difficult to capture all that IP year over year. And so, that's what we try to reinforce. And, it's tough in these days when, there's been COVID lockdowns and, businesses are not as successful as they were a couple of years ago, right? For a lot of different challenging reasons. But we try to convince management that it's important that our budget stay in step with R&D. So otherwise you're going to have a lot of innovation that we're not going to be able to capture.
Yeah, that's no doubt true. We're going to come back to that in a minute, because as the audience probably knows, one of my pet peeves does deal with R&D budgets. But I'll save those thoughts for later. Sean, your initial thoughts to get us going here today.
Yeah, thank you, Gene. It's nice to be here with Jake and Mark as well. Fortunately, our founder, Dr. Jonathan Rothberg, sort of similar to Medtronic, he's always about maximizing societal impact and saving the lives of someone he loves. So he always has, in all cases, a personal story when he starts one of his specific companies. The great thing about Catalyzer is, Jonathan is very IP savvy and often takes a hands-on role, particularly when he starts a company and he has a vision for a brand new product that doesn't exist. And so we are fortunate enough to be able to be aggressive with our IP filings, because we know, unlike a mature public company, when we're looking to raise funding rounds, as you know, it's critical to have your IP protected. And so we don't often, yes, we want to do things efficiently in terms of cost, but we want to err on the side of being aggressive and protecting everything we can, because IP is one of the few things that companies at our stage have. We've got to make sure we've got everything covered.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great way to look at it. At the beginning, IP is one of the few things that you do have, and I know we have a couple representatives from what you probably would call the life sciences, although Medtronic is probably a little bit more on the device side. Is that fair to say, Mark? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
on the slash medical side of the equation. But I remember many years ago, the CEO of Bio said that the companies at Bio, the startups, when they start, all they have is they have a folder that's their only real tangible property is a folder to hold the patents that they're acquiring, and that's it. That's all they have, and maybe a microscope here and there, and then they got to raise money in order to move forward for maybe a decade or more. So IP is so central to what's going on. And some companies get it, and other companies don't necessarily get it. And we're going to talk about that today. Nick, before we kick off with your slides, I want to give you the same opportunity. Do you have any initial thoughts you want to share?
Sure. It's always interesting when we put together a publication and a ranking in this case, and we've developed a methodology and we have our outputs, but to actually speak with the organizations that are on that list and determine what are maybe the commonalities behind their strategies and their initiatives, where are the differences and how they kind of align and they cross. So it's always interesting from someone who speaks with customers every day to find out what the back end story is. So that's going to be one of the main things I'm going to be interested today to figure from our panel is what are the similar strategies or differences that we can take away?
Yeah, and my initial thought here is, yeah, I'm excited anytime I get to talk about innovation, and it just, and a plug for something we're not talking about here today. If you ever get a chance to go to the National Inventors Hall of Fame, their annual induction ceremony, you have to take that opportunity at some point in time. If you really are in this industry, that needs to be on your bucket list. And if it's not already on your bucket list, add it to your bucket list, because that is just an unabashed celebration of innovation. You get all these living Hall of Fame members there, and it's just wonderful. And that's, I think, what we're going to do today. And I really got excited about this particular webinar because I don't particularly like lists, and I've been for years trying to figure out how can IP Watchdog, how can we do a list? We're probably one of the few publications that don't really have a list. And the reason is I don't know how we do a list that is content, it has content integrity, right? How do you do it other than just counting the number of patent applications that get filed, or the number of patent attorneys that you have, or the trademark victories, or how much money you recovered this year versus, and that doesn't really tell you anything about quality, about who you should be talking to, about who's doing really creative and interesting things. So when I saw this list and I saw small companies and big companies and mid-sized companies and a real interesting justification for putting them there, I thought to myself, okay, now this is a list I can really get behind, because it gives everybody a real shot to be on the list, number one. And number two, it really conveys, I think, what's going on behind the curtain. Without obviously giving up any confidential information, you can see why these companies are successful. The companies that are successful are going to be in the top of these graphs, and the companies that are not that successful are going to be in the bottom of these graphs, and that is not happenstance, that is descriptive. And so that's my lead in. And Nick, I'll let you take it away here now and explain where this all comes from.
Great, thanks, Gene. And that was a perfect seamless lead in, because what you mentioned there are some of the reasons on why we published a report. And that's what I'm going to get into. Beginning is an introduction to why we developed this ranking and what some of our findings were when we were looking into the ranking. So part of our job function in our customer success team is that we do consulting projects for customers, and we also provide or produce scientific and commercial publications. So this is one of those that we did and worked on all last year. And when we were thinking of basically how we could come up with some type of ranking, we looked at the rankings out there, and the reasons why we thought it would be we could add to the information that's publicly out there in terms of innovation and ranking lists is we found an opportunity where two aspects where we could differentiate ourselves and positively contribute to the conversation of innovation and rankings. And what we determined was, well, firstly, transparency was a main aspect that we wanted to look at. And what we found is that hardly any of the rankings that we were looking at were fully transparent with their methodologies. And to put a definition to transparent here, what I'm referring to is, could anyone who looks at the report reasonably and ultimately reproduce those results and have a meaningful conversation from those results? So that was the first criteria that we wanted to look at, and we thought we could clearly differentiate ourselves. The other is not just, and Gene, you already touched on this, but not simply focusing on the sheer quantity of an organization from an IP perspective. So not just looking at the number of patents filed or the size of their portfolios, but taking into account that quality aspect and the quality of their contributions to the technology field. Quantity does give us the scale. However, the quality is really a critical component. Making sure that you're developing and maintaining the right patents within your portfolio. What this inclusion of this component allowed us to do is to recognize smaller organizations. So not just the largest and the biggest filers, but also those smaller or medium organizations who are still actively and positively developing their portfolios, but they just might not have the sheer scale of those larger organizations. And this methodology that we looked at would really allow us to identify who are the top innovators today, who is actively developing their portfolios in a positive manner, and what we are able to do in this report is break down these companies into various components. So breaking down into various industries, deep dive into a couple of those industries that's included in the report, and also provide a regional breakdown too of these companies. And as mentioned in the beginning, there will be, you have the ability to download this report from this webinar. So what I'm going to do now is take this kind of intro and overview into the methodology and dive a little bit deeper into it. And what we can see here is that we wanted to really distill some other criteria as well as year-over-year changes, as well as some other different categories that I mentioned, industries, technologies, and regions. But we wanted to take all of these aspects and distill it down to our core analysis that we typically use in our patent site product. This core analysis you're seeing as a graphic here on the screen. It's our quality versus quantity chart. We call it our bubble chart, where essentially we're looking at two components. Along the x-axis, the horizontal axis, we're looking at the portfolio size. This is the active number of patent families for a company. And then the y-axis, we're looking at our average quality, which we call our competitive impact. And here we're showing two examples of companies that would make it onto our report. The red, and what we're looking at here is movement over the past couple years in terms of the average quality and the size. Question we typically get from our customers, and what ultimately led us to building this innovation report and the metric behind it, is what defines a positive movement. So as your portfolio is navigating along a path, moving in terms either decreasing or increasing in size, or increasing or decreasing in quality, what is a positive movement? What is a positive trajectory? Where should your portfolio be, and what are the areas it should be in this chart? So in order to, from those conversations with customers, what we wanted to do was be able to distill that down to one single metric. Now, these two examples of portfolios that would be included in the report give insights into some of the aspects that I've gone over in the creation of this methodology. So first, if we look at these two bubbles, the red bubble would be a smaller portfolio, but a very positive path. Very high increase in terms of average quality. The average quality is doubling over the 2-year period where the portfolio is increasing slightly. This would be a prime example of a trajectory of a smaller player who would make an author report, whereas on the other side, the flip side, the blue would be a large organization who has been increasing its size, whereas the average quality has been slightly increasing. Now, for portfolios of this size, growing your portfolio and maintaining the average quality to be either the average of our database or above average in terms of if you're benchmarking patents is extremely difficult. The reason it's extremely difficult and the way to maintain or increase your average quality would be that any subsequent filings would have to be the same or above in terms of the current quality of the portfolio. So the expectations for a larger portfolio being able to be innovative is much more moderated than, say, a smaller company, which might have more dynamic growth. So in order to ensure that...
Can I just interrupt you there for a second? Well, with those larger companies, you can actually break them out based on like their segments and see if they're, like if they got into a new segment, see like, so like you could say that this new segment that they've gotten into, well, this area is much more innovative and maybe looks a lot more like the red on the left, correct?
Yes, you can do that, and that can be done in various ways in the system, either with keyword analysis, or we do have various technology classifications through automated machine techniques that can break down a portfolio, and then you would be able to track those trajectories for those different classifications, essentially. So in order to what I wanted then in terms of how do we distill this down to a single metric? We wanted to make sure that we were keeping true to what we thought would be our key differentiator, which would be fully transparent. So we built this around our patent asset index methodology, which is in a published scientific journal, which has been peer reviewed. It's been used over the past decade or more by our various customers and even been included in analysis done by government bodies, including the European Commission. Many of you probably are aware of this from various webinars that we've had, but in case anyone isn't, I'll go through a brief explanation of the methodology just to make sure everyone has an understanding. So the patent asset index, really what we can do is see what the innovative strength of the patent portfolio is. So if I work from left to right here, through the research, so this was developed out of academic research, it was looking at what are the various indicators that would identify a quality portfolio, or specifically, or maybe just even one quality patent family. So through that research, it was determined that there was 2 indicators that led to an objective view of quality. One was looking at forward citations and looking at what is the rate of those forward citations, but also providing some corrections. So correcting for the age of patents, the technology field that the patent families are in, and also the citation practices of the various authority offices. So taking into account those factors, we developed an indicator called technology relevancy. And when we look at this and we take a look at all of the values across our database, we come to a database average of 1, which is nice and clean, but it happens to be that case. So I'm bringing up these benchmarks because these will be pertinent to when I get into the actual calculation of the innovation momentum. And then the other indicator is, well, what is the legal enforceability from a global perspective? So if you have this highly relevant patent from a technology perspective, what value does it if it can't be enforced, was kind of the thinking. So we take a look at not just the number of authorities that the patent family is protected in, but what is the value of that protection, and we use a gross national income for that. So for instance, if you have a patent family protected in the US, it would have a market coverage score of 1. And the more authorities that you have covered, that market coverage score would increase. So we take a product of those two indicators, we get the individual strength of a patent family, which is called the competitive impact. And we multiply because we want to make sure that there's a equal distribution of when we talk about strength, that something is of high relevance and also protected, to make sure it is a high value patent as opposed to just an imbalance of one or the other. So if we take all of the competitive impacts of a patent portfolio, we sum those up, that gives us the overall strength of the patent asset index. And you saw in the bubble chart how we can trend average quality over time. We can even trend the patent asset index, but that's really more of the strength as of today. But what we wanted to do was, in this report, is capture really the innovation change. So we use the patent asset index as our benchmark, but what we did is that we wanted to really take a look at change of those. So the change of the patent asset index. So we'll see here, if we plot on the vertical, the y-axis, the technology relevancy. So this is a citation indicator that I mentioned in the methodology. We want to see at what was the relevancy of that portfolio 2 years ago versus what is it that equate to in today's terms. So we're looking at 2-year increments here. And what we can do is break the relevancy of today into a couple subcomponents. So how does the relevancy from 2 years ago equate to today, which we look at the technology relevancy 2 years ago, the portfolio size 2 years ago, and then the portfolio size today. So what did the technology relevancy from 2 years ago equate to today versus what could we expect the technology relevancy to be from an increasing perspective. So if just solely looking at how the portfolio size changed from 2 years ago to today, what would we expect the technology relevance to be? And that is the blue box that we see here. And in this calculation, you can see that we do multiply by 1, and I brought up the 1 as a benchmark earlier. This part of the calculation is kind of really unnecessary, but it's more of a reminder that we are benchmarking, or we are benchmarking to the average, basically, that this expected increase would be if your patents, the relevancy changed from an average perspective, where should that technology relevancy be? What we then see in the green box is essentially, well, what was the actual performance compared to the expectation? So was it beyond what we projected? Did it exceed those expectations? So this is where we're pulling in the actual technology relevance as of today versus the historical relevancy and where we would have expected it to be. So this is where we can see exactly, is that portfolio increasing above expectations? And this output can actually be negative. So a portfolio could actually change, the momentum could actually be negative. They could be not meeting the expectations that were generated. And this view here, if we just go to the final calculation, we want to pull back in the market coverage, because we again want to make sure that if we scale this, that the portfolio included are reasonably protected in a reasonable number of jurisdictions, and also bringing back in the portfolio size to make sure that the increase in the portfolio is also a reasonable increase in terms, again, taking into account scale, because we want to make sure we have a good balance between the scale as well as the quality portion that is listed here. So when we take into account this calculation and we apply this to our entire database, what we were able to do is then focus in on the top 100 companies that had the largest positive values out of the entire database. So what I'm going to pivot over to now is what those 100 companies, the list of those 100 companies on that bubble chart or that quality versus quantity chart that I had introduced earlier. What we're looking at here, again, just as a reminder, the horizontal or x-axis is going to be the size of the portfolio, and the average quality or competitive impact is going to be on the y-axis. Now, we have the entire spread of the 100 companies. We can see here we've broken them into various segments in terms of smaller portfolio sizes, medium portfolio sizes, larger portfolio sizes, and you can see that we have a nice spread across. The ratio is about 60-30 in terms of larger portfolios compared to smaller portfolios. What we can see, we're calling out some specific companies on here. So for instance, Moderna Therapeutics has been in the news of a lot of late for various world issues that are going on right now. So vaccines is the main reason why they're on here. And really a smaller portfolio, but a great trajectory in terms of the quality of their portfolio and how it has increased over the past 2 years. Other companies we can see in here, Magic Leap. This is mostly from a virtual reality, augmented reality perspective. Nike, big name on here as well. Deere & Company, you're probably wondering, well, why are they on there? So looking at farm equipment. Well, they're getting into aspects of autonomous driving, unmanned vehicles. So really thinking of how a more traditional company and portfolio can innovate itself and really change the trajectory of where their IP is going. And we see our panel on here as well too, and their portfolios and where they fall on the range and the charting of the top 100. So we can see Afino and 4Catalyzer under the smaller segment of the portfolios, and Medtronic, as you mentioned earlier, the sheer size of the assets in their portfolio being in that more larger quadrant. So to dive in a little bit and give just kind of some context for the competitive landscape for our panelists organizations and what their trajectories have been over time. If we take a look at their portfolio sizes and their competitive impacts, we compared them to a couple peers in their industry just to show what are the dynamics here and how different organizations, their portfolios can change over time. So we can see 4Catalyzer making onto the report due to the great increase in their average quality over time, their portfolio size increasing, and then maintaining that average quality as their portfolio size has almost doubled over time. This is in comparison to some of the other competitors on here that have either maintained kind of the exact size of their portfolio, but their average quality has increased as their solutions have become more relevant in the technology field. So Maui Imaging, for instance, and then even Pacific Biosciences, they're kind of the same trajectory as well, whereas the average quality is increasing, but the portfolio size has not really increased that much for that smaller companies, which we kind of need a balance of both for the smaller companies to make it onto the list. Taking a look at Medtronic here, we can see the sheer size of the active portfolios. Looking at familiar names, Philips on here, kind of in the same area and trajectory somewhat of Medtronic, as well as then some of the smaller competitors in that space where their average quality has been increasing, such as Intuitive Surgical, Edwards Life Sciences. Average quality is increasing, and the portfolio size on a different trajectory than some of the larger filers. You can see others that their portfolios have been decreasing over time. So Abbott and Boston Scientific and Olympus are actually in more of a downward trend in terms of portfolio size and even average quality in some aspects. So it's interesting to see how these questions that we get of, well, what do these trajectories mean? The Innovation Momentum Report can help give insight into, are these trajectories positive or negative in nature? And lastly, Affinio's competitive landscape, some major players in terms of portfolio size on here, Huawei, LG Electronics, but we can see Affinio has been, their average quality has increased dramatically over here in comparison to some of the other competitors that are on here. So this is where a great example of how a company that's in a competitive landscape with a lot of large entities was able to, because of their innovation and their development, has been able to be on the same list as some of these major entities like Qualcomm, for instance, or Apple.
So, Jake, let's start with you again here. Ofino was last there in the slide, and maybe Nick, if you could go back to the Ofino slide.
Sure.
You know, I have some suspicions as to why it is that your quality has skyrocketed there. But what can you tell us about what's going on at Ofino, and that would allow your portfolio to double in quality over the last couple of years?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a lot of different factors. From management, our founder, Ishmael Dinan, he started the company in his basement. He was a prolific researcher in WiMAX and became a patent agent. And then he left the major carrier and started this company in the heavy research focus and patent focus, and then took pretty much all profits and dumped it into more research, hiring more PhDs, building it. We draft all of our patents in-house. So there's no disconnect between the patent attorneys and the inventors. There's constant communication. We integrate the patent process into the innovation process. So as we're working on the patents, we're still, coming up with new ideas. So, we've just taken a large amount of pride to focus in on quality and to keep, working a flywheel, so to speak, to keep innovating and keep inventing. That's a few of the things.
So how many patents does Ishmael have himself? Do you know?
I think so. He's on the list of prolific inventors on Wikipedia. I think the number reported there is something like 800 or so, but
Yeah.
I think it's above that.
Yeah, he's just so it really obviously helps when your founder has that many patents. So he values patents. And when you say, can you give us a little bit more color about when you say that your patents are drafted in-house? What does that actually mean? Because and I'll give you a little bit about what I'm thinking. I'll lead you along the way here. Is, I hear a lot of times from companies that the engineers and PhDs that they employ, their job is not to be involved in the patent process. Their job is to invent. And it becomes almost very difficult for patent attorneys to get any time at all with them, let alone, the meaningful amount of time to figure out what it is that they're actually doing. So how does that extreme compare, which that extreme is actually to some extent maybe more normal? How does that extreme / normal compare to what goes on at Ofino?
Yeah, it's completely different here. So, like I mentioned before, there's usually, the inventor just submits an IDF form and then it goes to outside counsel and they draft. But here, our invention disclosure process is extremely detailed, and then inventors are heavily involved with putting in the details to those ideas. And since we have patent attorneys, we have about 9 patent attorneys and agents on staff. We're constantly working together on the patent application. So there's really no disconnect between the two groups. And the inventors are helping us come up with new embodiments and working through claim issues and helping us, even, work through figures and drafting like sections. So, it's very different from the outside counsel traditional approach.
And
And
so they really
it's
do
by
work.
design, actually. So
Say that again. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
no, it's completely by design. So when Ishmael was working at the carrier, he felt that there was such a large disconnect between the inventors and the patent attorneys, and so it was kind of his goal when he founded the company to come up with some fully integrated multidisciplinary team in this process. So that's, it's been the focus of the company as a real core competency.
Mm-hmm. So, and I know what you're describing is actually your PhDs, who I don't think you guys hire anything other than PhDs, um, work elbow to elbow with the patent attorneys, and that's not just literal. That's actually descriptive, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we have about 40 PhDs on staff, and I think we train everyone on patent law also, and I think some of the you know the managers and inventors here know patent law better than some patent attorneys that I know.
Mm. Yeah, and they also contribute to the office actions, as I understand, right?
Yep, that's absolutely right.
So it's the whole process. So like when I hear companies that complain about not being able to get their inventors to buy into the process, and then I know what goes on at Afino, I think to myself, I don't know what to tell you. I just don't know what to tell you, because I know how it's supposed to look, or how it can look. And when it looks right, the results are very different. And Mark, I want to pivot to you, because I mean, Medtronic is sort of, like at the other end of the spectrum. You guys are extremely large, and Nick, maybe you could push the Medtronic. Are we maybe actually there we go. And the thing that strikes me is it appears as if the portfolio has increased in size and the quality has gone up. And that strikes me with a portfolio as large as Medtronic's is, how does that happen in 2022 when everybody else is, they're cutting their research and development budgets, they're cutting their legal budgets, they're firing in-house counsel, they're telling their outside counsel, you're charging us too much money, do more for less, which none of that is a recipe for increasing quality. But yet, you look at what Medtronic is doing, and again, not surprisingly, Medtronic is a huge successful company.
Yeah, so I think, it's got to be very intentional, right? And so you're right. We've gone through some challenging times the last couple of years, and budgets have been tight and all of that. But, we have kind of a culture of innovation, right? And it's always been very important to the company. And as a consequence, patenting has been very important. And, so it's kind of in the culture. And I think it depends on the company, right? I know there's some software companies where, they don't like patents. Like that's just the general reaction is the engineers don't like patents. Whereas, I think more hardware related companies seem to be more pro patent, right? Just their mentality, right? And so we have more kind of hardware sort of engineers, and that's more the mentality there. So they like patents. They understand they're important. They're important to our mission, right? Because we can't have a better product if we can't make money. And so, patents are all a part of that. And so, you've got to start there, but it's also a lot of intentional work, right? And so when you have decreasing budgets and you have challenging times, how do you, increase the value of your portfolio? I think you have to be very, intentional about that. And the way we've done that is we've taken a hard look at our patents. We've gone through a pruning process that, was fairly painful, but in the end was, allows us to save enough money and get rid of sort of the dead weight, if you will, so we can reinvest that in our own new innovation and make sure we're patenting the latest technologies and the new technologies and all of that. And, and I think it helps us overall because, some of these patents, like, they started out good, right? And then you go through a process, you get to the end of the process, and maybe they don't cover what you thought they covered, right? And at that point, you're very happy to get a patent. It's like, hey, I issued a patent, isn't that great? And it's like, well, let's look at it, right? And what does it really cover? And is it really useful to the company? And do we need it filed in 12 countries, right? And so we were very intentional about looking at all of that and making some hard decisions and making the cuts there so we could reinvest in things that we think that are more important to us. And the other thing we tried to do with quality is put some processes around the whole patenting, strategy, if you will, right? And so we've got 20 operating companies that were operating pretty independently and had different ways of doing things, right? And there wasn't a lot of consistency among all of them. And so we tried to come up with some overall, goals and objectives to make everyone a little more consistent. We tried to, we created this thing called the asset evaluation panel, where we look at each patent and we try to rate it in terms of, does this cover our product? Does it cover a competitor product? Is it easily discoverable? What's the review level that we've put into it to make these determinations, right? Has it been previously licensed? What's the encumbrances on it? That sort of thing. And so we look at all those parameters, and then over time, you're able to look at the portfolio and see, are we moving in the right direction? If we're trying to cover more competitor products, are we doing that, right? And hopefully we're at least covering our products and making sure the patents actually do that, because that's their primary objective, if you will. And so just having more data points to look at it all and from a higher level, make sure we're on track, if you will.
Yeah. So one of the things that that comes up here is it seems like culture is just so critically important. And I wonder, one of the things that I have heard from outside counsel occasionally. So there's the culture inside, and then there's the culture that you try and develop and nurture with your outside counsel. And sometimes I know, and I don't know this specifically dealing with Medtronic, but I know that there are attorneys that work for large, let's call them the Fortune 500 companies, particularly if you've just started working for the client and you inherit some cases, and the cases got really no chance of getting a patent, or no chance of getting a meaningful patent, as you mentioned. The new attorney doesn't want to be the one that the bearer of bad news, because they're on your fourth or fifth RCE. So, well, obviously the company must want this one, and that may or may not be the actual case. How does a big company like Medtronic cultivate the culture in outside counsel to, give you the honest feedback that you really need in order to make your decisions?
Yeah, and I think it starts with understanding what we want as a company, right? And like I said, we didn't always want one thing. We wanted 20 things. We were kind of all over the map, right? So first, it's like sit down and figure out what are your actual priorities and what do we want from outside counsel. And once you figure that out, trying to have a meaningful relationship with them. So we have a lot of different outside counsel. We're actually trying to narrow that number down so it's a little bit more manageable, so we can work with them more closely. But we've assigned relationship managers to each of those firms, so that person understands not just their own portfolio that's with the firm, but all the other portfolios that are with that firm and kind of where it fits in overall in the grand scheme of things. So then we can communicate to them, in your example, like maybe we don't want to be on the fifth RC. Like maybe the attorney thought that was important. They really wanted to get it, issued, but maybe we're looking at it and saying, anything over 2 RCEs need to be elevated, and we need to discuss that and see whether it's really worth it. So we can maybe just cut that out before we get to 2 more RCEs that we all know are pointless, right? And so being more strategic about, are we spending money in the right places? Are we fighting the right battles, right? And getting outside counsel bought into that. So they, like you say in that example, they don't feel bad coming to us and saying, hey, honestly, I don't think this has a chance. I'd rather know that up front than have someone just, pound the wall for, a year, right? And so making sure they feel comfortable telling me that, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's that's great, because that's the way it all works. I mean, because everybody, no matter how big you are, you only have but so much of a budget, and you can't be spending your budget chasing stuff that isn't going to be worthwhile. So
yeah, exactly.
So Sean, let's pivot to you for a minute, and Nick, if you could put up for Catalyzer. So for Catalyzer, look, is grown from really a very small portfolio to quite a large portfolio here, and has continued to grow in quality. And I know you're a bit of a different company. I think you said that you guys are not for profit, and you spin off the companies when they get to certain maturity, and then you start over with others. And did I get that right?
Yeah. I kind of think of it as, again, our founder, Jonathan Rothberg, who's been a serial entrepreneur ever since getting his PhD in molecular biology from Yale. He used to start a company, and then there was an exit, and then he started another company. And he's always going to do that. But at one point, he decided, he's starting multiple companies at once, and so when you start a company, there's certain things you need. You need finance, legal, HR, IT, and it doesn't necessarily make sense to hire an IT person for each startup. So, For
Right.
Catalyzer provides, the certain core services that you need, but perhaps for one single startup company, you don't need a full-time employee. So,
Mhm.
so we have institutional knowledge, and we have these shared services, one of which is legal, and in our case IT legal.
So
And
to some extent, that makes what you guys are doing even more remarkable. You're doing this across the number of startup companies. So what's the secret? I mean, how are you guys growing and maintaining the quality? I mean, is it that what you refer to as institutional knowledge?
Well, I was listening to Jake earlier. In some ways, we're a little bit like Jake's company in terms of having a founder who's a prolific inventor, and wants to hire the very best people, the PhDs. Jonathan's like, who's the smartest person? He'll go to an MIT professor. Who's your best and brightest student in this particular area? And we try to recruit those people.
Mhm.
But in terms of getting the patents filed, we do use outside counsel, and we worked with the same firm for over 20 years. In kind of my role as internal, what's important is, as Mark knows, those costs can really add up. So we really want to do as much internally as we can to make sure, for example, things are patent ready. The engineers and scientists are working, and I think if Jonathan had his preference, he'd tell you, just take a picture of a schematic on a whiteboard and text it out, and that's the disclosure, and then get back to work and get your product out. But
Mhm.
we all know, as IP attorneys, we need a lot more background explanation. We want to know, yes, we want to know how the invention works, but why do we think it's novel versus what non-obvious? So really, from my end, I want to make sure that we are ready to get it into outside counsel's hands, because in the old days, if they were working directly with outside counsel in a company, like you might be paying a team of outside attorneys to sit in on what really is an engineering meeting, and they're
Mhm.
just kind of riffing, but it's not what we would consider an invention disclosure meeting, where the point is you've decided something is going to go into the IP pipeline, and you send it to your outside counsel, and they may spend an hour or so looking at it, getting an idea, and they were ready to begin drafting an application, and so they want to ask specific questions, to their outside counsel, and so that's when we want them to actually begin work, because we can. The engineers and scientists think it's great when our IP counsel are sitting in meetings, and their PhD attorneys are speaking in that really down in the trenches technical discussions, and that's all well and good, but I have to think, are we getting value out of that in terms of, is this advancing a particular patent application, or is the outcome of an hour call, well, that sounds great and exciting, but let us know when you have more details. So those are the types of
Right.
challenges that guys, let's talk to me. I'm always available. I'll tell you if I think we need some more documentation, and then let's use our outside counsel when they turn on the billing machine, that they're actually doing things like drafting and things that provide us with value.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's a great point. I've always been a fan of that. You want to, when you're hiring counsel, you don't want them to be doing the stuff that they don't add value to. You want to hire them to do the things that adds value. So the more that you can do inside, the better off that you are. And it's always been frustrating to me to work with companies that don't. I mean, some companies don't even want you to talk to the engineers or the inventors, and It's like, well, how the hell am I supposed to do this? You gave me one paragraph. Who's the inventor going to be? You gave me a paragraph and a cryptic drawing that looks more like a stick figure than anything else, and and a title. I mean, I'm going to wind up being the inventor, So and that always has struck me as a recipe for failure, or a recipe for an extremely narrow patent that doesn't match what your business is actually doing or needing.
Yeah, no, we definitely want our outside counsel to have relationships with our scientists and engineers. Again, it's just when they're communicating, it's they're doing it in a capacity like always come to me first. If I can't do it myself or help you, then we need our outside counsel. And one example is the four catalyzer companies. There's so many technical disciplines among the companies and even within a company. So you've got we've got molecular biologists, we've got chemists, we've got chip designers, we've got mechanical engineers. And so, most people know the typical patent attorney kind of falls on one side of the fence. You're an electrical computer person, or you're a mechanical, or you're a chemical something. So depending on what your technical discipline is, you can give them high level advice. But like, for example, molecular biology is not in my technical wheelhouse. And I've learned a lot being there. But at some point I know, okay, I can only give you advice on this level. And so now we need to use our outside counsel. But I always, again, try to say, hey, I might be able to answer that question in 15 minutes for you.
Right.
We don't need to on the phone. We certainly value them and we use them, but let's use them when we need to use them.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point. So one of the questions that I always get, guys, is from people is when you're at a company that doesn't do it the way that you all do it, and the way that the common denominator that I'm hearing is relationships, culture, institutional knowledge. All of those things that really are foundational to creating a creative workplace that encourages both innovation and the protection of that innovation. If you're not at a place that has that, how, and I mean, so the patent attorneys, they tell me, I know that that's what we need. How do you try and bring that culture? How do you create that culture? How do you convince your managers or your senior managers that this is necessary? Any thoughts on that? I mean, other than just saying, like, look at the people who are succeeding and look at what we're doing. What we're doing is not working. Maybe we should try what they're doing.
I mean, I think for us, it starts at the top, right? You have to convince, the CEO that this is important, or maybe the CEO already views one thing as important and you need to explain how IP ties into that, right? And so our new CEO wanted to come in and he wants to be more competitive. He wants to make sure people aren't infringing on our innovations and aren't making things that we feel like are in our wheelhouse, right? And so the only way to do that is through enforcing your IP. And the only way to do that is to make sure, A, you have good IP, and to make sure that IP reads on not just your own products, but competitor products, and enough of a bubble around your product that people can't infringe your product, right? And so it has to start from the top. So if it's important to CEO, then he's going to make it important to his reports, and it's going to trickle down, right? I think to try to do it any other way is challenging, because if the main person's not kind of on board with that messaging, then it's going to be very hard to change the culture.
Yeah. Mark, how important do you suppose, or do you think the CFO is? A lot of times I hear that, because getting face time, and I'll even say, because we did this conversation several years ago with Raymond Hegarty, and he's been a chief IP counsel at a couple of different companies. And what he said is, exactly what you said, it's got to come from the top. But it's often difficult to get any kind of face time with the CEO. But it's sometimes a lot easier to get face time with the CFO. And if you can convince the CFO that this is not a zero-sum game, then at least maybe you have more of a champion in that boardroom. Thoughts on that? And not just Mark. I'll start with Mark, but I'll ask the rest of you the same question. Mark.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, if you can get the CEO in your corner, the CFO in your corner, right, they can give you the budget you need to make everything come true, right? Because without budget, we can't do much at all, right? And so I would say that was true of my last company, where once you get that person on board, then it is a priority, right? And it'll be funded accordingly, and you can go out and do what you need to do. And they're obviously, they have the ear of the CEO also, right? So it's an important ally to have on your side. So yeah, no, I fully agree. That's a great way to go if you can't get the CEO's attention.
Right. Sean, your thoughts on that strategy, maybe?
Well, fortunately for us, it's a problem we typically haven't had. Again, our our CEO is very pro patent. But having said that, some of the more mature companies will eventually start to hire out the C-suite, and it's good to have the CFO and the other business people on board. I think for them, my experience with them is they've all been pretty much on board, and they have provided some helpful business insight. Because sometimes you might hear something that we filed on 6 months ago or a year ago. They're like with startup companies, there's a lot of kind of pivoting, not the main mission, but an avenue they were going. 6 months later, it's not quite as important. So maybe there's something we don't go as aggressive on. But they're pretty much understanding. They do want me to just make sure the invoices look correct, and we're not being charged for stuff we shouldn't be charged. But everybody's always accessible, and our organization is not so big that everybody knows who the legal team is in the 4C companies, for example. So.
Yeah, and Jake, I suppose you don't have this problem either, since Ishmael is so patent proud, I suppose is the way to put it. But do you have any thoughts on gaining allies and influencing friends in the C-suite?
Yeah, I mean, I like that you nailed it, but I felt just like Sean said, is very fortunate to have a CEO who's just very patent focused. But I still think like making the business case and the use case to the COO and CFO, really helps us, not just filing patents, but broadening our international filing strategy, and developing new business areas beyond our traditional research areas. So just trying to make like a business case for everything really seems to help.
And what kind of information are they looking for, Jake, when you're trying to go there and say, I know we haven't filed here, but we're thinking that the filing here might make some sense. What kind of information are you presenting to get them to say yes?
Sure. A few things. One is, what are our competitors doing? And, other is, what does the market look like in those countries? And how strong is their patent regime is also another important factor. And then, we're also, considering patent pools. And so there are considerations, how those treat different international filings as well. So, those are a couple of the factors that we kind of use and discuss.
Okay. Right. Nick, do you have any questions for the panel? I think you might have some questions as well. I don't know that you do, but I thought maybe you might, and I wanted to kick it over to you to see if you had any thoughts.
No, not really right now, Gene. Actually, I'm just trying to think about. It's been really interesting for me to hear the back end stories, because as the color commentary that they add to these charts, because we can obviously say based off of trends, this is what we see, and from the metrics moving up and down. But it's really enlightening for me to hear what were those decisions that went into that. So just kind of more absorbing from my standpoint, because it's always good when we're dealing with different industries for them to say, well, what have you heard from others? What their strategies
Yeah.
are? So this is really powerful for us to further conversations with others.
Well, in what I'll say is, in that webinar we did several years ago, and again, with the pandemic, I've kind of lost track of time, so I don't know how long ago that really was. With Ray Haggerty, we were showing charts and graphs and so forth, and there was one chart that we completely anonymized because it was a really, really ugly chart. And his comment was, that is something you never want the CEO or the board to see. That is, and I'll never forget what he said. He said, that is a career limiting chart, and so, sometimes when you're not doing it right, it's very apparent. And when you are doing it right, it's equally apparent. So one of the questions that I do have is, and this is maybe where I was going with it with Jake, how much of this kind of information do you think you need? Like, if you're trying to show, like, well, here's what our competitors are doing, and like in Mark, even if you're just developing a new line at Medtronic, this is what our competitors are doing. This is where we stand. You go in with charts to show them. I mean, because what I've always been told, and the reason I'm asking this question is, CEOs usually don't have a whole lot of time. It's so much easier to digest something in a picture, and then if it catches their interest or attention, now, okay, well, tell me more. It's almost like when you're hunting for a job, that first page of your resume has to get them to want to turn the page to read the second page, or to actually want to have that initial phone call. So what do? Do you go in with charts like these? Do you go in with analytics? Do you go in with data? What do you do? I'll start with you, Mark.
Yeah, and it depends, right? Like on your audience, right? So when I was at Google, they were definitely very data driven, right? So you would come in with charts like this, and they would love it, and that's exactly what you needed. At Medtronic, at first we didn't, we had a new CEO, we didn't know exactly what he wanted, but we finally landed on something that looks very similar to this. It was sort of a bubble chart that we called our competitive assessment, and what it did is it looked at both, kind of our patents and what they cover, and our, opponents' patents and what they might cover of our stuff. And then it decreased or increased the size of the bubble depending on the revenue potentially at stake, right? And so it was a easy visual way to say, here's what we have, here are our weapons, here are their weapons. And if we were to, press the nuke button, like, who's going to win, right? Like, to try to figure it out at that level, right? Because a lot of times, people want to be aggressive, they want to, enforce their patents, but they don't stop and think about, well, there could be blowback risk, right? Like, we have a very successful product company, right? So what's the other company have that could be used against us, and how much revenue do we have at stake, right? And so when you do, do this battle, who's going to ultimately win? And even though you may win, like we said, we have 20 operating units, even though operating unit A might have a very good case against company B, the blowback might be on, operating unit C, right? And the exposure there could be greater than, the entire litigation that we were contemplating, right? And so you got to put everything into perspective, understand where, all the bodies are hidden, if you will, and what's going to happen, and do these scenarios that are, that are kind of well thought out. So when you do go to the CEO, you can answer all the hard questions and think of things maybe they weren't thinking of, right? Because they're sometimes focused on their one objective without realizing the other implications of filing a lawsuit, right? So we all know when you file a lawsuit, there's a lot of things that could happen. So thinking that through and being able to answer those questions, I think, is very important.
Yeah, the funny thing is if you're a lawyer and you've ever been sued personally, then you understand that a lawsuit is the last thing you want to be involved in, so you got to be careful, because they take on a life of their own, and they have a way of also becoming all consuming, and really just anybody who's involved in it, sometimes has a lot of trouble focusing on things that do not relate to the lawsuit. So it can be, it's a sometimes you absolutely positively have to do it, and certainly in this environment, unfortunately for patent owners, a lot of times it's the only way you can monetize, and that's a different webinar for a different day. But you can't just, I think, go and file lawsuits without serious consideration. Sean, your thoughts on data, catching the attention of the CEO, getting them to focus on what you need them to focus on at the moment?
Yeah, the businesses, they do like charts. A lot of it is for, again, at our stage, for the board meetings and showing progress to investors. One piece of data is just something that they used to like years ago, was kind of a document that we sort of had internally on the IP team, like a patent swim lane chart, for example, where it just five stages of, an application was in preparation, an application was filed, an application was in active examination, an application's allowed, how many, and then finally the issued patent. And then I'm like, well, maybe we could track this twice a year, just take a snapshot, and each time, every 6 months, just update it to see how the pipeline growing.
Yeah.
I found what was interesting was, the earlier 4C companies, over time, they were very similar in terms of, okay, when the company was a year old, here's what they had. When it was 3 years old, here's what the patent portfolio looked like. And I found that there was, a lot of similarities. And what would happen was, a company president from one of our companies would see that we had, is, oh, can you do one of those charts for me? And I'm like, sure, because it's great, and it's manageable, right? Because we don't have the portfolio that a Medtronic does. It's it's a manageable number, and it's as long as I'm the type of person that likes to update things. Don't let it go. Like, your outside counsel reports this case got allowed, or sometimes I'll go and pair myself just to say, I wonder what's going on with this case. But there are things that are easily updatable, and management really appreciates it when you can get back to them really quickly, because you're providing service. It's like, oh, we got a board meeting tonight. Do you have, can you give me the latest whatever chart? So from that sense, they do like data, because a lot of times it helps to tell a story for a fundraising pitch or a board
Yeah. And Jake, is that sort of the same for you? Data is king to get them to make the decisions you like them to make.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's just everyone's stretched for time, and so if you have a chart that explains everything, kind of like Mark said, that really like helps make that information digestible and actionable.
Yeah. So, well, we don't.
Gene, I was actually wondering, I
Sure.
actually, as we're talking, had a question as you brought up the analytics. A lot of what we're talking about with maintaining quality and driving innovation was taking a look interior at what your various professionals have. What role does your competitive landscaping provide in driving your innovation and ultimately maintaining your quality, as we're talking about some of these analytics that were just discussed?
Jake, you wanna lead off there?
So I think
If you can, I know,
as much as I can share now,
as much as you can share.
Yeah, I mean, I think, when we notice a competitor, doing something differently than us, we have a company culture of asking questions. And so, it's always, why are they doing it this way? Should we be doing it this way? Is that a better way of doing things? So, we pretty much use it, their statistics to question our statistics, and then question the statistics themselves. So it's a high level response.
Yeah, but I think it's fair to say that your PhDs are very engaged. I mean, they're very thoughtful, and they really are. I mean, one of the things I think, correct me if I'm wrong, you don't have a policy that prevents them from reading other publications or other patents, right?
No, it's very open. Although I will admit, we file a lot of IDSs. We have to keep track of everything.
Yeah.
So that's a hassle. But
Yeah.
it's encouraged to open look at everything. It's not really an ostrich syndrome here at all.
Yeah, and and again, that's a big difference from some companies that in the past, at least, and I think this may be going away, but these things take a lot of time to dissipate, where there was an absolute prohibition against reading, at least issued patents or things that have been filed. And that has never struck me. I mean, if you're trying to innovate, how can you do that not knowing what others have already done? I mean, innovation by definition is new, something that's new. And it's not new to you, it's new to everyone. Mark, your thoughts?
Yes, I don't know if we have a policy one way or the other on that, but I think we do look at competitors at a more macro level, right? And so we want to know, where are they filing their applications, right? Like what jurisdictions are important to them, and understanding that. And then, understanding just, size isn't everything, but you do want to understand, do they have 100,000 portfolio, 50,000, 20,000? Like it's relevant, in general, to kind of know what you're dealing with, right? But I think more important is the quality. And so we do try to look at different systems that try to assess quality or rate patents and that sort of thing, so we can have some idea of whether we're doing good compared to them or not. And and going back to the funding also, like understanding like what are our competitors' R&D spend, how many patents are they filing with respect to that, to kind of see whether we're in the same band as they are. Are they at a 50% filing sort of scenario, or 20% of the new innovations? And so trying to measure that in a way that makes sense, and then comparing yourself to that to make sure you're not way out of whack with respect to, strategics.
Yeah. And Sean, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think by and large it's fair to say we don't spend too much time worrying about what competitors are doing. I think, our different operating companies' thoughts are, we're going to be the first company to do this. So from that perspective, there might be other companies in the space that have done things a traditional way. And I know our founder has certain views, like kind of in his view, Gene, it's almost the opposite of yours. Like, how do you innovate unless you know what's out there? I think, his view is that he's very much tries to avoid his team being distracted. So I think the thought there is, if you're concerned about, okay, what are other people inventing or patenting, you're somehow that's one avenue that's closed off. In other words, he doesn't want to be distracted by what others are doing, so that his team can be as creative as possible and move as fast as possible.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I also think, years ago I interviewed Manny Schechter, who's longtime chief patent counsel for IBM. And when the question of competitors came up, they were like, we just move forward. We don't look back. We don't look sideways. We just move forward. And that certainly, makes a lot of sense as well. All of these different philosophies, at the end of the day, it's how you implement them. But I do, and I think so. I'm stuttering because I'm trying to think about this, because I think what we're coming to here now, when you start to get to some of the nitty gritty about how you implement the philosophy, is there are different ways and different lanes and different choices that you can make and still be successful. But the key is the culture and the giving your people the freedom to create. And then I also think what we see is across the board here is having the inventor actually having time to actually participate in the process on whatever level, whether it be with in-house people or outside counsel. And then the last question that I had, Mark, and it's specifically to you, because I know that you did litigation, and of course, Jake and Sean, if you have any thoughts on this, feel free to jump in. But I know you don't do litigation in your current role, but in previous role you did, and I wondered, with what's going on in litigation, do you ever go back and make sure that the people on the prosecution side of the business know what's happening and how things are being interpreted, and make sure that implements? And the reason that I ask is I've had a chance one time, and I won't say which company it was, but to look at a portfolio over a long stretch of time. It was an investor who contacted me to look at a number of patents, And I looked at a number of patents in this company over a long stretch of time, and you could see the evolution as they were chasing whatever the 101 theory at the moment was. You could see the writing of the applications change. So I'm wondering, how involved does the litigation team or the head of litigation get in that education process?
Yeah, so I think what we did in my prior job is we tried to have, well, we did it a couple of different ways, but one was you had these periodic lunch and learns, right? So they were every, 6 weeks or whatever. And we would have each of the different, divisions, if you will, come in. So we'd have licensing present one, we'd have litigation present one, prosecution present one. And it was a way to just have a feedback loop, right? So on the licensing side, we'd say, okay, well, we just did this licensing engagement. Here's an example of a patent that we showed. Here's an example of the feedback we got of, invalidity or 112 issues or whatever it was, and point that out. So, it's not to criticize the prosecutors, but it's just to say, look, like, you wrote this thing 10 years ago, you couldn't have been aware of some of these issues, right? But this is what we got back. And how can, if we have pending applications, how can we improve them going forward? How can we try to get rid of these issues? How can we get rid of, divided infringement issues, right? I mean, that's a drafting thing that can be solved, right? So just being aware that that's an issue and, drafting it from the right standpoint. How do we deal with 101, right? A couple of years ago, 101 was a huge thing and everyone was trying to figure out how to deal with it. And so, and sometimes we invite outside counsel too and try to just figure out the best strategies for dealing with 101, claims. How can we beef up the specification or whatever the case may be, right? So I think that's one way to do it, are these sort of open and honest communications with everyone. And then the other thing we've done, is have outside counsel review, right? And so, and what I mean by that is to internally look at the cases that outside counsel is preparing and sort of, look at, 5% of them or whatever it is, a low number, but enough of them that it's, meaningful. And just look at them in terms of, are the claims good? Are there any drafting mistakes? Are there divided infringement issues, et cetera? And, for the most part, our outside counsel checks are pretty good, right? But it helps, rate the firms, if you will. We compare the different firms and what's the quality we're getting back from them. And if you do find issues, it's a great way to have, that relationship manager reach out to them and say, here's a couple of things we noticed that we liked, here's some stuff that we didn't like. Let's figure out the best way to fix that going forward. And, that way they're continually trying to improve. And, when you just say, we're not happy with you for quality reasons, if you don't have specific examples, it doesn't mean anything. Like the outside counsel doesn't know what to do with that, right? But if you can come back and say, here's 2 cases where we looked at, we identified these 2 issues, and you talk that through, that's a meaningful conversation. They can then go back, talk to the associates, and try to run that to ground.
Yeah. So we have a question from, I know we're running short on time here now, but one of the questions I think we could get to quickly here is thoughts on inventor incentive programs. Do they make a difference? Are they good or are they bad? I mean, while you're thinking about your answer for that, I can tell you I've heard both good and I've heard, bad. I've heard situations where inventors will, if you pay them per disclosure, at the end of the month, inventors will just sit there and write every crazy idea that they have and drop them into a box in order to get, extra money, and so that's not particularly useful to anybody other than the inventor. So they can be abused for sure, but thoughts on them? Mark, I see you shaking your head. Are you familiar with some abuses?
Yeah, and you've got to design the program properly, right? So we had in one of my prior companies, we did it on information, the invention disclosures, we did it at filing and at issuance, and it really did drive the wrong behavior. Exactly what you explained would happen, right? You'd have a bunch of disclosures on stuff that's not patentable, and then it was a burden on the attorneys. They had to sift through all that and figure out what we actually file, and our yield rate was like under 10%. It was just not a useful program at all, right? At our current company, we reward on filings and issuance. I think it's a good way to do it. If you get something at least filed, it's gone through a patent review board, it's done all the right things, and it's worthy of that sort of reward. And I think in a lot of instances, the inventing community expects it, right? They do expect some sort of an incentive program. So I think it's important to have one, but it's got to be designed properly to drive the right behavior.
Yeah. Sean, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I kind of probably fall more into Mark's camp. We've never really had one, although one of our newer companies, there was an individual that came in. He was kind of helping internally manage IP before transitioning back to just being scientific. Wanted to put in a program, but it didn't really go anywhere. I don't necessarily think that our people are motivated by that. I do think they appreciate patenting, and I think some of them actually look at having patents almost in the way they do authorship. We do have a lot of scientists that are hired out of being in academia for many years, so a lot of times they'll actually kind of conflate patenting with being a publisher. And the caveat there is, of course, there are different standards for being an author on something versus being an inventor in a patent application. But as far as the incentive, we don't do it.
Yeah. And Jake, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always a danger if an incentive program is unchecked. You're going to have a lot of filings that probably should never have been made. But we do have an incentive program, but there are checks and balances and refinement processes, and I think those are just indispensable if you're going to have an incentive program for inventors.
Yeah, I think inventors like getting awards. So if you have an inventor, when they get a patent issued or something like that, you give them some kind of award. That I think goes a long way. People like to be congratulated. They'd like to be recognized. And the more of that kind of stuff you can do, I think is very useful. But I would be very hesitant. If I was chief patent counsel or chief IP counsel, I would never have an incentive program for disclosures. I just would never ever do it, for the reasons Mark set forth, and what I've seen at the companies. Now, I shouldn't say seen, what I have heard from the companies that I know that have had that. It just has not worked out. So we've reached the end, but I'd like to give everybody very rapid fire ability to give us your final thoughts, including you Nick as well. So let's start with, it'll go in the order I introduced you in. Jake, what's the one thing that you hope people remember from today's webinar?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just, I think the company culture of innovation is just, essential to keep innovating. So, I think that's a big focus and takeaway.
Great, thanks a lot, Jake. Mark, your takeaway message today?
I would just say it's quality over quantity. In my view, patents have little value if they can't either protect your product or cover a competitor, and have those goals in mind when reviewing your portfolio.
Great, thanks for being here, Mark. Sean, your takeaway, what do you hope folks remember?
Well, I think, again, it's your patent strategy can be your patent strategy, but no matter how big your company is, it's everybody's job. Like, everybody at least needs to know the importance of protecting your IP, and not just patents, trade secrets, whatever. So just be educated. And the one word we use is aggressive. If you're not sure, just spend a few bucks filing a provisional application without a fancy write-up, and just at least give yourself a filing date. If it turns out it's not so important, let it go. But it kind of follows the same thing. We err on the side of doing, and that includes IP protection.
Great, that's great advice. I'm a big fan of provisionals myself. For the cost benefit is just so useful. And I don't understand why they're not more used, but good advice. Thanks, Sean. And Nick, your final word, the final word goes to you.
Well, thank you. It's been interesting to hear the positive conversations that have come out of this report, and now how it's brought quality to the forefront of the discussion. And that word, as we've just been going around as takeaways, has been mentioned, I think, by every panelist here, and how there's a way to bring recognition, as we mentioned, that inventors like to have some type of award. This is a nice award to companies that are pushing and driving innovation within their organizations and fostering a culture of innovation. So I think that's a nice way to for any studies or publications that can bring notice to that across various different company sizes, I think is a positive thing.
Well, great. Well, thanks a lot, Nick. And thank you all for being here. And thank you, panelists, for a wonderful conversation. I think we heard a lot today, you know, and it confirms a lot of what we probably already knew. But for those of you who are at places that aren't doing it, quote unquote, correctly, now maybe you have a little bit of ammunition to go back and say, look, you know, here's this report. These are what these companies are that are succeeding, and this is what they say that makes them special. And maybe that gives you a little bit of a leg up, and you also got some advice as to how you might be able to talk to those CFOs and CEOs to really capture their attention. So I appreciate your time, and we look forward to seeing you again, but that's all we have for today. So bye for now, everybody.
Yeah, bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.